Picture this, right? It is January 1917, and we're deep in the Arabian desert.
Oh, setting the scene right away. I like it.
Yeah, you have to visualize it. So there's this Ottoman military convoy, and it's just snaking its way through this completely barren landscape. And they're on a super vital mission.
Right.
They're carrying this heavily guarded strongbox, and inside that box, 20,000 pounds in gold coins.
Which was a massive fortune back then.
Exactly. But here's the thing. This gold isn't for, like, buying weapons or feeding troops. It is literally a slush fund. It's specifically intended to bribe the local Bedouin tribes so they stay loyal to the Ottoman Sultan, and don't join this growing Arab rebellion.
Right, trying to buy their allegiance.
But before the convoy can actually reach its destination, they get ambushed. These attackers just sweep out of the desert, totally overwhelm the guards, and they seize the gold.
Which, I mean, on the surface, that sounds like this classic, highly romanticized tale, right? Like daring desert raiders striking a blow for freedom against the big bad empire.
Yeah, it sounds like a movie, right up until you realize exactly who those attackers were. Because the ambush was actually led by Emir Abdullah.
The son of the guy leading the Arab Revolt.
Exactly. And what does Abdullah do with this captured Ottoman gold? He turns around and uses it to bribe the exact same Bedouin tribes that the Ottomans were just trying to buy off.
It's just wild.
It is. It's basically rival empires literally throwing bags of cash at local tribes to to rent their temporary allegiance. So, okay, let's unpack this. Because that one single incident completely shatters this Hollywood myth we have of a pure, unified, ideologically driven fight for Arab independence.
It really does. It completely forces us to look at the actual reality of the situation because, we have this culturally entrenched image of the Arab Revolt. We all picture the flowing robes, the stirring speeches about national liberation.
The unified people throwing off the yoke of a foreign oppressor.
Yeah, exactly. But when you look at the raw data, the historical accounts, the internal documents of the people who actually orchestrated all of this, you find a landscape that is just far more transactional.
Very transactional.
Yeah, I mean, it was a war fought with currency just as much as it was fought with bullets.
And that is exactly our mission for you today. Welcome to this custom-tailored deep dive.
Huh?
We are taking the stack of sources provided to us, which, by the way, is a fantastic mix of material.
It's a great stack.
Yeah, it includes everything from historical encyclopedias covering the Mamluk and Ottoman periods, detailed travel logs that map out the brutal microterrain of the desert.
Which we will definitely get into.
Oh, absolutely. Plus, military strategy companions analyzing the birth of modern insurgency, and some deeply critical historical journals. Specifically, we're looking at the work of historians like Karsh and Karsh.
Really critical stuff there.
Right. Because our goal today is to unearth the gritty, highly complex reality behind the 1914 to 1918 Middle Eastern theater. We're getting into the Arab Revolt and eventually that legendary capture of the port of Aqaba.
But to really understand how we get to that ambush in the desert and eventually to that impossible trek to Aqaba, we can't just start in 1917.
No, we have to go back.
Right. We have to rewind to 1914, just before the outbreak of the First World War. We need to look at the geopolitical chessboard of the Ottoman Empire.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Well, for centuries, the Ottomans had controlled these vast stretches of the Middle East, North Africa, and Eastern Europe. But by the early 20th century, they were widely referred to as the sick man of Europe.
They were struggling.
Really struggling. The empire had shrunk considerably from its peak. They were dealing with massive internal fractures, crippling debt, and just constant pressure from European powers.
So you have the Ottoman central government in Istanbul, and they are trying desperately to hold this massive, multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire together, right? And their approach to doing that, especially under Sultan Abdulhamid II, was incredibly paranoid. Which brings us to the patriarch of our story today, Sharif Hussein of Mecca, the head of the Hashemite clan.
The man himself.
Yeah. And the myth paints him as this quintessential, wise desert patriarch ruling from the holy city. But his actual background is completely different.
It is entirely different. I mean, for roughly 15 years, Sharif Hussein did not live in the desert at all.
Wait, really? Where was he?
He lived in the Ottoman capital of Istanbul, in what was essentially a gilded cage.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, Sultan Abdulhamid had this specific policy. He would take influential provincial leaders, basically anyone who was a potential rival, and bring them to the capital.
Keep your enemies close.
Exactly. They were given luxurious villas, heavy stipends, high status, but they were absolutely not allowed to leave. It was just a way for the Sultan to keep a very close eye on anyone who might, foment rebellion in the far-flung corners of the empire.
I really want to pause on that for a second, because that detail completely reframes Hussein's psychology for me.
It has to, right?
Yeah, he is not some naive provincial leader out in the sand. He has spent a decade and a half swimming in the shark-infested waters of Ottoman imperial politics at the absolute highest level.
He knows how the game is played.
He knows exactly how empires function. He knows how to play factions against each other.
And he was a total master of political survival. We see this so clearly when a massive political upheaval happens in Istanbul. There's this political reform movement commonly known as the Young Turks, specifically the Committee of Union and Progress, and they actually seize power.
Okay, wait, I need to understand these Young Turks better. Because they seem to be the catalyst for basically everything that goes wrong between Istanbul and the Arabs. Who exactly are they, and why does Hussein even care if they take over?
So the Young Turks were this coalition of various reform groups. They were largely made up of younger military officers and intellectuals.
Okay.
And their core ideology was a shift away from the old absolute monarchy of the Sultan. They wanted to move toward a more constitutional government.
Which sounds good on paper.
It does, but more importantly for our story, they were ardent centralizers. And they were hardcore Turkish nationalists.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, the old Ottoman system was actually relatively decentralized. As long as the provinces paid their taxes and recognized the Sultan, local leaders like the Sharif of Mecca had a ton of autonomy.
Right, they could basically run their own show.
Exactly. But the Young Turks wanted to change all of that. They wanted a modernized, highly centralized state run directly from Istanbul with a super heavy emphasis on Turkish language and culture over Arab identity.
So if you are Sharif Hussein sitting in your gilded cage in Istanbul, these Young Turks represent a massive threat to you.
Huge threat.
Because they want to strip away whatever remaining autonomy the local Arab leaders actually have.
Precisely. And the Young Turks actually had their own favored candidate for the title of Sharif of Mecca, a man named Ali Haidar.
Oh, so they're trying to replace him.
They are, but Hussein, using all that political acumen he developed, he actually manages to outmaneuver them.
How does he do that?
He gains the favor of the fading Sultan, and he even subtly courts the British ambassador, Sir Gerard Lowther, to quietly back his claim. So Hussein manages to secure the appointment as the Emir of Mecca in 1908, totally despite the Young Turks' opposition.
That early maneuver tells you everything you need to know about Hussein's playbook. I mean, he is highly ambitious, he is deeply suspicious of the central government in Istanbul, and he clearly has zero reservations about leveraging foreign, non-Muslim powers to secure his own dynastic power.
None at all.
So he finally gets back to the Hejaz, which, for you listening, is the western region of the Arabian Peninsula bordering the Red Sea. It's home to Mecca and Medina. But he immediately realizes the Young Turks are going to try to crush his autonomy down there.
Which leads directly into the pre-war maneuvers of early 1914. So a new, very assertive Ottoman governor arrives in the Hejaz, Wahid Bey.
And he's got marching orders from the Young Turk.
Exactly. His orders are crystal clear. Tighten Istanbul's central control, implement forced conscription of the local Arabs into the Ottoman army.
Which they're not going to like.
No, not at all. And, crucially, extend the Hejaz Railway all the way down to Mecca.
Because that would allow the Ottomans to rush troops down there at a moment's notice.
Exactly. Hussein literally feels the walls closing in on him.
So he sends his son, Abdullah, over to Egypt to basically take the temperature of the British. Abdullah meets with Lord Kitchener and a British official named Ronald Storrs. And Abdullah basically asks them, hey, if my father pushes back against the Ottomans, will the British give us weapons?
And the British response at that time is just a hard no.
Right.
Because in early 1914, Britain still views the Ottoman Empire as a friendly power, or, well, at least a necessary buffer state against Russian expansion.
Right. They don't want to rock the boat.
Storrs explicitly tells Abdullah that the British are really only concerned with ensuring the safety of Indian Muslim pilgrims who are traveling to Mecca. They have absolutely no interest in arming a provincial rebellion and destabilizing the whole region. So they basically send Abdullah packing.
But then just a few months later, August 1914 happens. World War I begins.
Everything changes.
And shortly after that, the Ottoman Empire officially enters the war on the side of Germany and the Central Powers. So suddenly, the British strategic calculus just flips overnight.
It had to flip. I mean, the British had massive existential interests in the Middle East. They desperately needed to protect the Suez Canal, which was, the main artery to their colonies in India.
Right, their lifeline.
And they also needed to protect the newly discovered oil fields in Persia, which literally fueled the Royal Navy. So when the Ottoman Sultan, acting in his role as caliph, declared a holy war, a jihad against the Allied powers, the British absolutely panicked.
Because they had so many Muslim subjects.
Exactly. They feared this declaration would spark uprisings among the millions of Muslims living under British rule in places like India and Egypt.
So Lord Kitchener, who is now the Secretary of State for War back in London, he suddenly remembers that meeting with Abdullah in Egypt.
Oh, I bet he did.
Yeah, he realizes Britain desperately needs a prominent Muslim leader to provide a counterweight to the Sultan's declaration. They need an internal fracture within the Ottoman Empire to relieve all this pressure on the British forces. So Kitchener sends a message to Mecca, basically asking, are you with the Ottomans or are you with us?
And that outreach initiates one of the most controversial exchanges of letters in modern history, the McMahon-Hussein correspondence.
A famous letter.
Yes. Sir Henry McMahon, who was the British High Commissioner in Egypt, begins negotiating the actual terms of an Arab revolt directly with Sharif Hussein.
And, when you actually read the demands Hussein lays out in these letters, it is mind-blowing how completely misaligned the two sides actually were.
Oh, totally.
But Hussein is not just asking for British backing to secure his little local autonomy in the Hijaz. He is demanding a massive, unified Arab empire.
The geographical scope of his demands completely stunned the British in Cairo. Hussein demanded independence for an area bounded on the north by the 37th parallel.
Just to help you visualize that, the 37th parallel includes modern-day Syria. It reaches all the way up to cities like Aleppo and Mersina.
It stretches all the way east across Mesopotamia, which is modern Iraq, right to the Persian border. He basically wanted the entire Arabian Peninsula, moving south to the Indian Ocean, only excluding this tiny British protectorate in Aden.
So he was proposing himself as the absolute sovereign of a new empire that would basically rival the Ottomans in size.
Exactly.
And here is where I really struggle with the traditional narrative of the Great Arab Awakening. We are always taught to view this as a grassroots, romantic fight for national liberation.
Right.
But looking at Hussein's massive territorial demands, I just don't see a freedom fighter. I see a dynastic autocrat making a massive imperial land grab.
It's very imperial.
It really is. It feels like a hostile corporate takeover.
Yeah.
Hussein is basically trying to acquire all of the Ottoman Empire's southern assets, and he wants the British to act as his venture capitalists to fund the acquisition.
I think that venture capital analogy is highly accurate. I mean, the British intelligence officers in Cairo, who were the ones pushing this plan to their superiors in London, they never viewed Hussein as a peer. They certainly didn't view him as the future emperor of the Middle East.
No, they viewed him as a highly manageable proxy.
Exactly. They just wanted a localized, tactical rebellion that would force the Ottomans to divert troops away from the Suez Canal and hopefully secure the Red Sea coast for British shipping. It was a transaction built completely on mutual exploitation.
And the British make absolutely sure to weave deliberate loopholes into their promises, right?
Oh, of course they do.
When McMahon finally replies to Hussein in October 1915, he technically agrees to support Arab independence, but he throws in this incredibly consequential caveat.
And that caveat is basically the seed of a century of conflict in the Middle East.
Tell us what he said.
So McMahon states that areas west of the districts of Damascus, Homs, Hama, and Aleppo cannot be said to be purely Arab and therefore must be excluded from the proposed independent boundaries.
Which conveniently left the entire coastal regions of the Levant completely ambiguous.
Right. But the real poison pill, the really sneaky part, was his statement that Britain could only act in territories where she was free to do so without detriment to the interests of her ally, France.
There it is. The ultimate betrayal just hidden in plain sight with diplomatic jargon.
Yep.
Because the British are already holding secret backroom meetings with the French at this exact same time. They're represented by Mark Sykes and François-Georges Picot. And they are quietly carving up the exact same map of the Middle East into British and French zones of control.
The infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement.
It is a masterclass in imperial duplicity.
It really is. The British were essentially double-booking the real estate. They were promising the inland territories to Hussein to get his forces fighting, while simultaneously promising the influence over those exact same territories to the French just to keep their main European ally happy.
It's unbelievable.
They constructed this entire foundation of calculated ambiguity, knowing full well that when the war ended, whatever promises they made to a desert chieftain would hold far less weight than a treaty with a global superpower.
And this transactional foundation naturally leads us into the second major part of our deep dive today. Because if the leaders at the very top were just playing this cynical game of imperial monopoly, we have to look at what was actually happening on the ground.
Right. Who is actually fighting?
Exactly. When the revolt finally kicks off in June 1916, who is actually doing the fighting and why are they doing it?
Well, the sources, particularly the deeply critical analysis provided by historians Ephraim and Anari Karsh, they argue that we need to aggressively deconstruct this myth of the Great Arab Revolt.
Yeah.
Their central thesis is that this was not a widespread, cohesive nationalist uprising at all. It was just a dynastic bid by the Hashemite family, and they were operating in a region that had absolutely no unified political identity.
The lack of unified identity is so crucial for us to understand here, because the myth suggests that all Arab peoples, from the city merchants to the desert nomads, just suddenly realized they were one nation and locked arms against the Turks.
Which just wasn't true.
Right, the sociological reality of the Arabian Peninsula at the time was incredibly fractured.
It was a super complex mosaic of completely disparate groups. You had these distinct urban centers, and then you had a vast network of fiercely independent, often actively warring Bedouin tribes.
Right.
There was no overarching Arab national consciousness in the way, say, a 19th century European might understand nationalism. Take the urban populations, for example. In major cities like Medina and even Taif, the merchants and civic leaders had been interacting with the central Ottoman government for generations.
We relied on them.
Exactly. They relied on Ottoman trade routes, Ottoman security, and Ottoman administration to survive.
So when Hussein declares his grand revolt, the people of Medina don't just rise up to join him. They actually side with the Ottoman Turks against the local Bedouin forces that Hussein sends to attack them.
Exactly. Because to the urban elite in Medina, the Bedouin were often seen as a dangerous, chaotic force that threatened their livelihoods. And even within the cities that favored Hussein, like his own capital of Mecca, his authority was absolutely not absolute.
Right.
It was disputed by rival branches of his own extended clan who felt they actually had a better claim to the Sheriffate.
So if there is no burning, unifying desire for Arab nationalism driving these people, how does Hussein get the Bedouin tribes to actually fight a war for him? Because these tribes don't answer to a central state at all.
No, they answer to their own sheikhs, and their loyalties are determined completely by the immediate survival and prosperity of their specific tribe. So to get them to fight, Hussein needed leverage.
And what was that leverage?
It came entirely in the form of British subsidies, specifically British gold.
The financial logistics detailed in these sources are just staggering. I mean, I always knew the British supplied weapons, but the sheer volume of cash they pumped into the desert is hard to comprehend.
The British essentially bankrolled the entire operation. Over the course of the war, they supplied Hussein's forces with approximately 170,000 rifles.
Wow.
Which, ironically, was vastly more than his irregular tribal forces could ever actually maintain or use. But the rifles weren't the real engine of the revolt. The financial subsidies were.
Talk about the money.
Initially, the British provided Hussein with a monthly subsidy of 125,000 pounds in gold. And as the war dragged on, that was bumped up to 200,000 pounds a month.
Let's contextualize that because it highlights just how much the British favored this specific proxy. At the exact same time, the British were paying another prominent Arab leader on the eastern side of the peninsula, Ibn Saud.
The man who would eventually found modern Saudi Arabia.
Exactly. But they were paying Ibn Saud a tiny fraction of what they gave Hussein. Hussein's subsidy was roughly 40 times larger. In total, over the course of the campaign, Hussein received well over 2 million pounds in gold.
It was an astronomical sum, and it completely dictates the entire nature of the tribal alliances. The Bedouin fighters who joined the Hashemite forces were not motivated by the abstract lines that Hussein wanted to draw on a map.
No, they wanted the cash.
They were motivated by the immediate influx of British gold and the traditional promise of capturing loot from the enemy. In fact, the tribal leaders were incredibly pragmatic about it. They literally referred to Hussein's son, Prince Faisal, who commanded the Northern Army. They called him the man with the gold.
It's pure mercenary economics.
Yeah.
If Faisal showed up to a tribal encampment with a chest of gold coins, they were his loyal soldiers for the month.
Yep.
But if the gold stopped flowing, or if a raid didn't produce enough captured supplies, the tribes would simply pack up their tents and go home. Or worse, they would switch sides to the Ottomans, who were running their own parallel bribery campaign.
Which brings us perfectly back to the story you opened the show with. Emir Abdullah ambushing an Ottoman convoy and capturing 20,000 pounds in gold coins.
Right.
The Ottomans were sending that money to buy the loyalty of the exact same tribes the Hashemites were currently employing. It just highlights the deeply cynical reality on the ground. The great powers were simply trying to outbid each other for the services of irregular light cavalry.
It really makes you wonder how the Hashemite leaders actually viewed the people they were supposedly liberating. I mean, did they see the tribesmen and the villagers as brothers in arms, or just as tools to achieve their new empire?
The sources suggest a deeply ingrained elitism among the Hashemite leadership. They did not view themselves as equals uniting with their Arab brothers. They viewed themselves as the rightful aristocratic rulers dealing with unruly subordinates.
Ah, I see.
They actually harbored deep prejudices against other regional Arab populations.
Yeah, there is a quote in the source material from Prince Faisal that is just dripping with aristocratic disdain. He is speaking to a British officer about the Yemeni people who lived far to the south, and Faisal just dismisses them entirely as a people.
What does he say?
He says, to imprison an officer, his sheikh had only to tie a piece of string around his finger.
Wow. It was a profoundly insulting characterization.
Really insulting.
He is basically calling the Yemenis completely docile, spineless, and easily subjugated. He's implying they lack the martial pride of the northern Bedouin. It completely shatters this illusion of a fraternal brotherhood of equals striving for a shared national destiny.
So if we look at the state of the revolt a few months in, the British are sitting in their intelligence offices in Cairo, and they're doing the math.
And the math is not looking good.
Not at all. They realize they have poured hundreds of thousands of pounds into a rebellion that is geographically isolated to the Hijaz coast, completely fractured along tribal lines, and motivated almost entirely by cash. The Arab forces have already failed in a conventional assault to take the city of Medina, and the entire revolt is in serious danger of stalling out completely, or just collapsing back into tribal infighting.
So the British desperately needed a liaison officer on the ground. They needed someone who didn't just understand military logistics, but who fundamentally understood the transactional, clan-based psychology of the desert.
They needed a fixer.
They needed someone who could orchestrate these fractured mercenary groups into a coherent tactical force without triggering their resentment of foreign authority.
Enter a certain young, highly eccentric, Arabic-speaking British intelligence officer, Captain Thomas Edward Lawrence, the man who would be immortalized as Lawrence of Arabia.
But here again, we have to strip away the cinematic myth.
I really do.
Because the movie version presents Lawrence as this solitary, messianic figure. He rides alone into the desert, single-handedly learns the ways of the Bedouin, and magically unites them through the sheer force of his charisma.
But that's not real.
Not at all. The historical reality paints a much more complex and, frankly, more impressive picture. Lawrence was a brilliant facilitator, a master of synthesis, who built his strategy on the grueling intelligence work of others.
I love this part of the sources because it brings in a figure who rarely gets the credit she deserves, Gertrude Bell. You just cannot understand Lawrence's success without understanding her intelligence gathering.
Absolutely. Gertrude Bell was a British writer, archaeologist, and political officer who was absolutely pivotal to the war effort. Long before Lawrence became the face of the Desert Campaign, Bell had been traveling extensively through the Middle East.
Since 1888, right?
Yes. By the time World War I broke out, she possessed an unparalleled, granular understanding of the tribal dynamics, the blood feuds, and the shifting alliances between the Hejaz Railway and the harsh Nafud Desert.
So what does that intelligence gathering actually look like in practice? Because she isn't just looking at maps of sand dunes, she is mapping the social fabric of the desert.
Right. Precisely. Mapping a tribe in the Arabian Desert involves understanding incredibly complex genealogies. You have to know which subclan has grazing rights in which wadi. You have to understand who owes a blood debt to whom, and you need to know exactly which sheiks can be bought and which will fight to the death.
That is intensely detailed work.
It really is. In January 1914, just months before the war, Bell actually made a highly dangerous trek deep into the desert to specifically meet with Sheikh Harb of the Howitat tribe.
And the Howitat are going to become the absolute vanguard of Lawrence's fighting force later on.
And Lawrence knew exactly how to approach them specifically because of Bell. The intelligence she provided to the Arab Bureau in Cairo was described by her colleague David Hogarth as a mass of information that was crucial.
So Lawrence just studied her homework.
He studied her maps and her tribal reports meticulously. He knew the pressure points of the society before he ever stepped foot in a habitat tent. He didn't invent the wheel, he just read Gertrude Bell's instruction manual on how the wheel was constructed.
Okay, so Lawrence has the social blueprint. But his real genius lies in how he applies that cultural knowledge to military doctrine. Because the Arab forces had a massive problem, and that problem was Medina.
Right.
The Ottoman army was heavily entrenched in the Holy City, and the Hashemites had already thrown their forces against its walls and been absolutely slaughtered by artillery and machine guns.
Lawrence recognized immediately that the Arab irregulars, these are men riding camels with rifles. They could never defeat a modern, entrenched Ottoman regular army in a conventional pitched battle. It was suicide.
Yeah.
So he flipped conventional military logic completely upside down. He looked at Medina and argued that the Arab forces should never try to capture it.
Which, if you are a traditional British general in World War I, that sounds like madness. I mean, the entire goal of warfare is to capture the enemy's strongholds and destroy their armies.
But Lawrence understood the mechanics of irregular warfare. He famously wrote, "We wanted him to stay in Medina and every other distant place in the largest numbers."
Okay, explain that reasoning.
It was brilliant in its simplicity. He realized that an Ottoman soldier sitting inside a fortress in Medina was completely harmless to the broader British war effort. Medina had no strategic value to the global war. It was just a political symbol.
But if you force the Ottomans to surrender Medina, suddenly you have a massive problem.
Exactly. Because if the Ottomans surrender, the British and the Arabs suddenly have to feed, house, and guard tens of thousands of prisoners of war in the middle of a desert where resources are already incredibly scarce.
That makes so much sense.
By keeping the Ottomans trapped in Medina, basically holding a useless city, Lawrence forced the Turkish High Command to commit massive amounts of troops, food, and ammunition just to guard the single lifeline that kept that garrison from starving.
And that lifeline being the Hejaz Railway.
Yes. The Hejaz Railway was a single track line running south from Damascus all the way down to Medina. Lawrence turned the Ottomans' own infrastructure into their prison. Instead of fighting the army head-on, the Arab forces, guided by British and French explosive experts, engaged in relentless, highly mobile guerrilla attacks along the entire length of the railway.
And we really have to talk about how they destroyed those trains, because they used a specific piece of technology called the Garland mine.
Right. Invented by a British officer named Major Herbert Garland, he was an explosives expert attached to the Arab Bureau.
I find the mechanics of this so fascinating. How do you effectively mine a train track in the middle of the desert without being seen?
Well, the Garland mine was this ingenious piece of improvised sabotage. It wasn't some complex electronic device. It was a mechanical pressure plate system.
Okay.
The saboteurs would dig out the ballast under a section of track, usually on a curved section of the railway, where the train naturally had to slow down anyway.
Making the derailment more catastrophic.
Right. And they would place a heavy charge of explosives, often gun cotton or blasting gelatin, right under the wooden sleepers.
And what was the trigger mechanism?
The trigger was the real genius part. They used the actual weight of the train against itself. The device was set so that the relatively light wheels of a scouting cart pushed ahead of the train wouldn't set it off.
Because the Ottomans would run a cart ahead to check for mines.
Exactly. It required the massive, crushing weight of the locomotive's main driving wheels to actually depress the mechanism, which then fired a detonator into the explosives.
Ooh.
Boom. The explosion would blow the locomotive entirely off the tracks, twisting the steel rails into spaghetti and completely halting the convoy.
At which point, the Arab forces, who had just been hiding behind the dunes, would sweep down, pour rifle fire into the confused Ottoman guards, loot the train for weapons, food, and gold, and then just vanish back into the desert before Ottoman reinforcements could even arrive. It is a terrifyingly effective tactic.
But Lawrence understood that to execute this kind of asymmetrical warfare consistently, he could not act like a traditional British commander barking orders.
Right, they wouldn't listen to him.
No, he couldn't just point at a map and tell a Bedouin sheikh to go blow up a train. He deeply analyzed the psychology of his Arab allies and codified his approach in a document sent back to Cairo, which is known as the 27 Articles.
And our sources specifically highlight a few of these principles, sometimes referred to as the 14 Articles of Command.
Yes.
These articles are a masterclass in psychological manipulation, cultural empathy, and just sheer leadership.
Yeah.
Let's look at the mechanisms behind a few of them. He wrote to his fellow officers, "Wave a sharif in front of you like a banner and hide your own mind and person." How does that actually translate to action on the ground?
It meant acknowledging a really harsh truth. Lawrence himself, as a Christian European foreigner, had absolutely no inherent legitimacy or authority in the eyes of the Bedouin tribesmen.
Right.
The only legitimacy rested with the Hashemite Sharif and his sons, like Faisal. Lawrence understood that what we now call bottom-up state building was essential.
Because the Arab society wasn't built on national institutions, right?
Exactly. He recognized that the political DNA of Arab culture at the time was rooted entirely in clans, tribes, and personal relationships. It wasn't rooted in Western-style national discipline.
A completely different mindset.
Yeah. A British soldier obeys an officer because of the rank on his uniform, representing the institution of the state. A Bedouin fighter obeys a sheik because of blood ties, personal respect, and proven leadership.
Okay, I get it.
The West emphasizes collective national loyalty. The East, as Lawrence observed, trusted individual persons. Therefore, every single strategic order had to be issued from the mouth of a Hashemite prince.
Which leads to my absolute favorite article he wrote. He advises British officers, never refuse or quash schemes he may put forward. Always approve them, and after praise, modify them insensibly, causing the suggestions to come from him.
It is the ultimate psychological trick.
I read this and immediately thought of the movie Inception, where the whole plot is about planting an idea in someone's subconscious so deeply that they wake up believing they generated the idea themselves. Lawrence is basically performing military inception.
He really is.
He wants to attack a specific bridge, but instead of telling Prince Faisal to attack it, he subtly guides the conversation, nudges the map, praises Faisal's tactical insight until Faisal suddenly proclaims, "We must attack that bridge." And Lawrence just says, "Brilliant idea, Your Highness. I will make the preparation."
It is a perfect analogy. Lawrence was practicing the ultimate form of leading from behind. He knew that if he gave a direct order, the tribal pride of the sheiks would demand they resist it or ignore it.
Right, you can't tell him what to do.
But if he manipulated the situation so that Faisal issued the order, the tribes would obey with enthusiasm. He also strictly warned his fellow officers against getting involved in tribal feuds or showing any favoritism, advising them to be above jealousies.
Because it's so fragile.
Exactly. He was constantly weaving a highly fragile tapestry of tribal alliances that could unravel at the slightest insult.
And he doesn't try to force them to fight like a European army either. He adapts their ancient, traditional way of life into a modern weapon.
Yes, he utilized the concept of the razzia.
What's that?
For centuries, the Bedouin had practiced the razzia, which was a swift, highly ritualized, mounted raid on a rival tribe.
Okay.
The goal was to capture camels, sheep, or loot, and then execute a rapid retreat back into the deep desert before the victims could mount a counterattack. It was hit-and-run warfare, born of an environment where holding territory was basically meaningless.
So Lawrence simply takes the razzia and upgrades it for the 20th century.
Exactly. He redirects the target. Instead of raiding the neighboring tribe for camels, he points them at the Hejaz Railway.
Wow.
He allowed them to use their familiar mounts, their traditional tactics, and critically, he allowed them to take plunder from the trains as their reward. He didn't ask them to dig trenches or hold front lines. He adapted their ancient lifestyle perfectly to the needs of modern mechanized sabotage.
Which brings us to a massive turning point in the campaign. Lawrence's mastery of tribal dynamics and this hit-and-run sabotage is incredibly effective at harassing the Ottomans.
Oh, highly effective.
They're blowing up trains left and right. But harassment doesn't win wars. The British needed a strategic breakthrough. They needed a logistical hub to feed this growing rebellion. And that leads to Lawrence's most audacious proposal yet, an attack that defied every single rule of conventional military logic.
This brings us to the ultimate strategic objective of the campaign, the coastal town of Aqaba.
Papa.
Right. Aqaba is situated at the very northern tip of the Red Sea in modern-day Jordan. By the summer of 1917, it was the last remaining Ottoman-held port on the Red Sea.
Let's break down the why for a second. Why did taking Aqaba matter so much to the British High Command? What actually changes if Aqaba falls?
Two massive strategic shifts occur if Aqaba falls. First, we have to look at the logistics of the Arab Revolt itself. Up to this point, the revolt was entirely dependent on British resupply coming out of Egypt.
Weapons, food, gold.
All of it. Delivering that supply to the southern ports of the Hejaz, like Yenbo or Rabi, meant a massive, arduous overland journey on camels, just to get it up to the front lines where Faisal's men were actually fighting.
It's an incredible bottleneck.
A terrible bottleneck. Taking Aqaba would give the Arab forces a viable deep-water resupply port right on the doorstep of the northern theater of operations. They could offload supplies straight into the fight.
And what's the second shift?
Second, and perhaps more importantly to London, was the broader British war effort. British General Sir Edmund Allenby was in Egypt, massing a massive conventional army preparing for a major offensive into Palestine, pushing north towards Jerusalem and Damascus.
The main thrust of the war.
Exactly. But if Aqaba remained in Ottoman hands, it sat directly on Allenby's right flank. The Ottomans could use it as a staging ground to launch attacks into the Sinai Peninsula and just cut Allenby's supply lines.
It was a dagger pointed directly at the British advance.
It absolutely had to be neutralized.
So the British Royal Navy looks at a map, sees a coastal port, and naturally assumes, okay, we will sail some dreadnoughts up the Red Sea, bombard the town with naval artillery, and launch a massive amphibious landing to take the beach.
The standard playbook.
Right. But Lawrence, working closely with the legendary Bedouin warrior Ada Abu Tai of the Howitat tribe, proposes something that sounds like absolute madness. They tell the British Navy to stay away.
Stay far away.
They want to attack Aqaba overland from the rear.
To understand why that was considered insane, you really have to look at how the Ottomans had fortified Aqaba.
Okay, what were they dealing with?
The Ottomans were not stupid. They knew the British Royal Navy ruled the seas, so they had heavily fortified the town against an attack from the water. They had heavy coastal artillery, deep trenches, interlocking fields of machine gun fire pointing right out into the bay.
But what about their rear defenses? What was protecting them from an attack coming from the inland desert?
Absolutely nothing.
Nothing.
Nothing. And they believed they needed nothing because conventional European military logic and Ottoman logic dictated that an attack from the landward side, from the east, was geographically and biologically impossible.
And why did they believe it was impossible? What was standing in the way?
The Nifu Desert and the vast, arid limestone plains surrounding Wadi Sirhan. To attack Aqaba from the rear meant starting near the Hejaz Railway, trekking hundreds of miles east into the deep desert, away from their objective, circling north through completely hostile terrain, and then cutting back west through the mountains to drop down on Aqaba.
That is a massive detour.
Depending on the specific route taken to hit various wells, it was an arc of roughly 600 miles. Some estimates put the total distance covered during the maneuvering at close to 1,000 kilometers.
Let's spend some time painting a picture of the Nifu Desert for you, listen, because desert is a very generic word. The Nifu is not just a sandy beach without water.
No, it's not.
It is an alien landscape. It is a vast basin of shifting, deep red sand dunes. The sand is so fine and loose that camels literally sink into it, making every step an exhausting struggle.
There is practically no vegetation to feed the animals.
And the water sources are just a few ancient, deeply hidden, highly unreliable wells spread days apart.
And we really must factor in the climate here. They are executing this march in the dead of summer.
Ugh, brutal.
We are talking about surface temperatures regularly hitting 45 degrees Celsius. That is 113 degrees Fahrenheit.
And there is no shade.
None. The wind blows the fine red sand into their eyes and lungs. It is a punishing, lethal environment.
How do you even survive that? I mean, how do 500 men and their camels carry enough water to make it across? What is the actual mechanism of survival here?
The survival mechanism was entirely dependent on two things: the biological endurance of the camel and the encyclopedic geographical knowledge of Ada Abu Tai.
Because he knew where the wells were.
Exactly. A camel can drink vast quantities of water at one well and survive for days before needing another, while also providing milk for the riders. But if a single well on their route was dry or had been poisoned, the entire expedition would perish.
They just die in the sand.
Yes. They had to navigate a featureless wasteland, moving from pinpoint to pinpoint. Lawrence later wrote of the psychological toll of the Nephid, saying, "The heat of the day on the red sand dunes made the sky flicker and the horizon melt. It was not a country for mistakes."
There's a quote in the travelogues from Sharif Nasir, a Hashemite leader who was actually on the trek, that sums it up perfectly. After weeks of this torture, he just mutters, "The Nephid is the worst place God created."
You can just feel the absolute exhaustion in that.
The cracked lips, the sheer force of willpower it took to push those animals and men across that wasteland. Here's where it gets really interesting, though.
How so?
Because here we see Lawrence and Ada Abu Tai achieving something profound in military strategy. They are weaponizing the environment itself.
Absolutely. We can analyze this through the psychological concept of terrain and perception.
Right.
The Ottomans felt perfectly secure in Aqaba because they trusted the desert to act as an impassable wall. They believed the environment would just kill anyone who tried to cross it.
And Lawrence knew that.
Lawrence understood that if you have a force tough enough to survive the terrain your enemy deems impassable, you achieve absolute, devastating strategic surprise.
But they can't just walk straight there.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, if an Ottoman patrol spots 500 armed men on camels heading north, they will send a telegraph, and Aqaba will just turn its guns around.
Yeah.
So Lawrence throws in this brilliant piece of misdirection to keep the Ottomans looking the wrong way.
Yes. While on this grueling, desperate march, they don't just hide. The Arab force deliberately detours to attack a small Turkish outpost and blow up a section of the Hejaz Railway near a place called Dera.
I love the psychology of this. They are exhausting themselves even further just to put on a show. So the Ottoman commanders in Damascus get the telegraph report. The Arabs hit the railway again, and they react exactly how Lawrence wants them to.
They assume it is just business as usual. The Ottomans think Lawrence is still just playing his game of harassing the trains. It perfectly reinforces the deception.
It's so smart.
It completely concealed their true objective and bought the Arab force the critical time they needed to vanish back into the desert and push further west toward Aqaba, long before the Ottomans realized they needed to send reinforcements down from Syria.
It's an incredible feat of endurance and psychological warfare. And for those trying to visualize the final leg of this journey, as they turn west toward the sea, the route took them through Wadi Rum.
Which is stunning.
If you want a visual reference, think of the movie The Martian where Matt Damon is stranded on the Red Planet, or the desert planet of Tatooine in Star Wars, or even the recent John Wick 4. Those sweeping, majestic desert shots were filmed in Wadi Rum.
It's iconic.
It is a landscape of massive, sheer sandstone mountains, carved by wind and ancient water rising vertically out of the red sand. It is breathtakingly beautiful, but totally unforgiving.
And after navigating that labyrinth of stone, enduring the relentless heat, the agonizing thirst, and the sheer physical toll of weeks in the saddle, the Arab force finally emerges from the mountains.
And they are entirely undetected.
Entirely undetected. They are standing on the high ground looking down at the back door of Aqaba.
That brings us to the climax of the campaign, the Battle of Aqaba, July 6, 1917, though calling it a battle might be a bit of a stretch.
The term battle definitely overstates what actually occurred on the ground because the strategic surprise was so absolute.
So what happened?
Well, the main Ottoman garrison at Aqaba was housed in a massive fortification right on the water.
The sources mention it was a 16th century Mamluk fortress. What exactly does that mean for the defenders?
The Mamluks were a powerful dynasty that ruled Egypt and the Levant prior to the Ottomans. They built this fortress centuries ago. It had thick stone walls designed to repel medieval sieges and pirate attacks from the sea.
So it's tough.
It's tough, and the Ottomans had updated it with modern artillery, but the fundamental architecture was focused outward, toward the water.
And there is the fatal catch for the Ottomans. Every major heavy gun, all their reinforced defensive emplacements, their trenches, their sight lines, everything was pointed out toward the blue waters of the Red Sea, just waiting for the British Navy to show up.
They were looking the wrong way.
They had virtually no defenses, no heavy weapons, facing the inland desert mountains right behind them.
It's the military equivalent of locking your reinforced steel front door, installing a state-of-the-art security system on the porch, but leaving the back screen door wide open.
I love that analogy. So when Lawrence, Auda Abutai, and their 500 exhausted but heavily armed Arab irregulars poured down from the hills, completely bypassing the heavy guns, the Ottoman garrison of about 400 troops was entirely paralyzed.
They realized instantly that their position was mathematically untenable. Their own heavy guns couldn't traverse far enough backward to fire on the hills.
That is amazing.
The garrison surrendered with negligible resistance. The psychological shock of seeing an enemy force emerge from an impassable desert broke their will to fight immediately.
The casualty figures are astonishing, especially when you contextualize them. This is 1917. Up in Europe, on the Western Front, the British and French are losing tens of thousands of men in a single afternoon to gain a few yards of muddy trenches.
The contrast is insane.
Meanwhile, down in the desert, this irregular Arab force captures a highly strategic port city, completely alters the map, and they suffer only about 25 casualties.
It was a supreme masterstroke of maneuver warfare. The victory at Aqaba fundamentally altered the strategic posture of the entire Allied campaign in the Middle East.
So what changes immediately?
With Aqaba secured, the British Royal Navy could finally dock massive supply ships safely. They poured thousands of modern rifles, millions of rounds of ammunition, food, and even armored cars directly into the theater, right where Faisal needed them.
And it solves General Allenby's problem.
Completely. It eliminated the threat to his eastern flank. Allenby could now launch his massive offensive into Palestine with total confidence. The Arab forces out of Aqaba effectively became the right wing of the British army. They screened Allenby's flank as he executed a coordinated, massive push north through Palestine and Syria, which would ultimately lead to the capture of Jerusalem and eventually the fall of Damascus.
It is an amazing historical narrative, but as we look at the legacy of this battle, it's not just about who won or lost in 1917. It's about how this single operation forced militaries around the world to change how they think about war.
If we connect this to the bigger picture and look at the broader evolution of military doctrine, the Aqaba campaign is arguably the birth of modern desert warfare.
Really, the birth of it.
Yes, and a foundational text for special operations. Lawrence and the Arab forces proved a radical concept, that extreme mobility, deep, long-range penetration behind enemy lines, and the rapid concentration of firepower at an undefended weak point could completely negate a numerically superior and heavily entrenched enemy.
It proved that an army doesn't always need bigger guns. Sometimes it just needs a better understanding of the map.
Precisely.
It validated the idea that a small, highly motivated group of irregulars could cripple a massive bureaucratic empire if they simply used the extreme environment to their advantage.
And that tactical playbook did not disappear in the sands of Aqaba when the war ended.
No.
Not at all. In the 1920s and 30s, military explorers and theorists like British officer Ralph Bagnold obsessively studied Lawrence's methods and the geography of the deep desert.
Because they knew another war was coming.
Right. And decades later, when World War II broke out and the British were fighting the Germans and Italians in North Africa, those exact concepts directly inspired the creation of elite special forces units.
Units like the Long Range Desert Group and the SAS.
Yes. The Long Range Desert Group, the LRDG, and the Special Air Service. Instead of camels, they used heavily modified, heavily armed jeeps and trucks.
But the idea was the same?
The doctrine was identical to Lawrence's. Traverse impassable dunes, navigate by the stars, survive the extreme heat, and strike suddenly at General Rommel's vulnerable supply lines and airfields from the deep desert before vanishing back into the wasteland.
They perfectly echo the camel-borne raids of 1917.
They really did.
I want you listening to really think about that for a second. Think about how often today we assume that the side with the superior technology, the biggest missiles, the most advanced drones, the strongest concrete fortresses, is automatically destined to win a conflict.
It's a common assumption.
History repeatedly shows us that having a deep, granular understanding of the local culture, mastering the psychological motivations of your allies and enemies, and figuring out how to turn the physical terrain itself into a weapon is often the ultimate, unbeatable advantage.
Well said.
The Ottomans had the heavy artillery at Aqaba, but Lawrence and Otta had the Nefud Desert, and the desert won.
It is a profound, enduring lesson in asymmetrical warfare. I mean, the technology of war constantly changes. We go from camels and bolt-action rifles to jeeps and drones, but the fundamental human and environmental factors remain absolutely decisive.
So after wading through all of this, what does this all mean for us today? We started this deep dive by talking about the clean Hollywood myth of the Arab Revolt.
Right. The pure, unified fight for freedom led by a lone messianic savior.
But what we've actually uncovered in the sources is a much grittier, infinitely more complex reality. We saw Sharif Hussein's highly ambitious, almost imperial land grab negotiations with the British Empire.
We saw a regional revolt that was heavily fractured along ancient tribal lines.
And fueled not primarily by a shared sense of modern nationalism, but by millions of pounds of British gold and the mercenary pragmatism of local sheiks.
We looked at T.E. Lawrence not as a solitary romantic hero who did it all himself, but as a brilliant psychological tactician.
A man who relied heavily on the grueling intelligence gathering of Gertrude Bell.
And who understood exactly how to manipulate the rigid tribal dynamics of the Bedouin to achieve broader British strategic goals.
And it all culminated in that impossible 600-mile trek across the lethal Nefud Desert to capture Aqaba by weaponizing the environment and achieving total surprise.
The romanticized Lawrence of Arabia myth has, for over a century now, heavily obscured the transactional, tribal, and financially driven realities of the Arab
Yeah,
Revolt.
it really has.
When we strip away the cinematic score, what we see is essentially a massive proxy war. It was funded by a global empire, utilizing fractured indigenous forces to achieve broader geopolitical aims, all while promising those same forces a future that the empire had already secretly signed away to someone else.
And that leaves us with a final lingering thought for you to mull over. If our popular mainstream understanding of one of the most famous historical conflicts of the 20th century is built on such romanticized, heavily simplified myths, how might that be blinding us to the gritty, complex realities of the world right now?
That is the big question.
When we watch the news today and see modern proxy wars unfolding superpowers, funding local militias across the globe, are we just falling for a new Hollywood script? Or are we actively looking for the modern equivalent of the British gold, the hidden tribal rivalries, and the invisible terrain that is actually deciding the outcome?
It is a vital question. Understanding the past in all its muddy complexity is really the only way to accurately read the present.
Thank you for joining us on this custom deep dive into the sands of 1917. Keep questioning the narratives you are handed, always look past the romantic myths, and never forget that history is always far more complex and far more fascinating than the movies make it seem.